up until, I don't even know, Photoshop CC at some point recently. This is, I gotta tell you, as much as I'm a fan of the whole Creative Cloud concept, as an instructor, it's the most horrible thing to try and say, well, back when it was, wait a minute, I think it was CS6, no, it was the first version of Photoshop CC, not 2014. Anyway, if you look under your filter menu and you see Camera Raw filter, use it. If it's not there, you don't have it. That's about the easiest way to remember. So if it's not there, then you'd have to start with a raw file. So let's actually do that first. So here, let's use this one. Here is a Camera Raw file. When I double click on it in Bridge, it opens in Camera Raw. And some people, when Camera Raw first came out, they're like, oh, that's a little more complicated than using levels or curves. And my reaction is exactly the opposite. This is so much easier than levels or curves. Because think about, you open a photograph and you open the curves adjustment layer, and all you want to do is make the image a little better exposed. Well, where do you click on a line to make it better exposed? In Camera Raw, the very first thing says exposure. It's black at one side, it's white on the other. I think almost anyone could figure out, if I want to increase the exposure, I would drag to the right. So to me, that's one of the reasons why I recommend, when you're first starting out, this is actually a great place to go, because it's completely intuitive. You look at a list of options. Oh, there's contrast, there's highlights. You know, all these things are just right there, and there's sliders that move left, right. And in each case, you can tell it's going to get darker this way, lighter that way, whatever it is. Okay? The challenge is, by nature, this is not non-destructive. So by nature, if you didn't make a change I'll show you in a second, it would be a one-shot deal. And that's the problem people run into, is that they don't know about this little change you need to make. They think they're making the equivalent of adjustment layer, and then they go to change it and they can't. So I have already made this change, but I'll show you in a second how to do it. But this also has all these options. I mean, we're just in this one area, but here's an example. The question was asked before about white balance. This is one of the only places where you actually see a phrase, a term that says white balance, and you can either pick from a list of camera white balances or use the white balance tool and say, I'm going to manually make that decision. So if nothing else, Camera Raw is the place I would start first to make sure my color balance is, the white balance is the way I like, and then I bring it into Photoshop, and frankly, I might still make a minor levels or curves adjustment, but probably not as much because of all things I can do in here. Okay? Do you have a question?
Yes, so you can open up any kind of file in the Camera Raw filter?
You can open up, well, here's the difference. Camera Raw launches if you double click on a raw file. This Camera Raw can also work with a TIFF or a JPEG. The advantage of the Camera Raw filter is it actually is a layer by layer Camera Raw. So you could actually have a person isolate on a layer by themselves and now apply Camera Raw settings to just that one layer, which was never possible before. And that's what makes it, to me, very exciting, is it's not just a global thing anymore. It's, I could take this one layer and say, just do Camera Raw on this layer, do a different Camera Raw on that layer. And that's where it gets really interesting. So, everyone, don't look. Look away. Don't look at the screen right now. So this is what Camera Raw works by default. Is you open an image and you say, okay, I'm going to make this adjustment, and then there's a big button that says Open Image. And when you do, it opens it into Photoshop. The problem with it is, as much as it's very nice, is it's almost like you open it from Camera Raw into Photoshop, the end. Meaning it's a background layer. If I wanted to go back and say, wait, I need to tweak this one more thing, there's no go back to Camera Raw option. It's a one-way dead-end street from Camera Raw to Photoshop, which is okay. But because of my way of thinking, where I want to do that non-destructive, always able to change my mind thing, I want a way to go back. And it's there, it's just not obvious, and it's not turned on by default. So I'm going to close this and do it again. So you have to do this one time in Camera Raw, only once, and then if my advice to you is and never ever turn it off again unless you're showing someone the difference like I am right now. So for me, it's always on. I had to go and turn it off to show the difference. And unfortunately, and I've told my good friends at Adobe multiple times that I think, ironically enough, because Adobe likes to talk about making things more discoverable, and this is an area where they're, let's just say, have not made it terribly discoverable, because it's like, I don't know that I would click on this unless I knew it was there, because what we need to do is open the workflow options. So as you can clearly see from this dialog box, if you look at the workflow options button, which doesn't exist, see this thing at the bottom that says Adobe RGB 1998, that when you click on it, oh look, workflow options. Huh, how about that? So personally, I understand why it looks that way, because it's useful information you can change on the fly, but to get to this very important button, a lot of people don't even realize that's a clickable thing that includes this button. So look right down here, it says Open in Photoshop as Smart Objects. And that means from now on, when I click Open, it's not going to be a one-way dead-end street, it's going to create a live connection between Camera Raw and Photoshop. So here's what it means. I'm going to overdo it to make a point. I'm in Camera Raw and I think I'm doing a wonderful job making an adjustment, but I've overdone it. Previously, when it said open image, I would have got into Photoshop and gone, darn it all, or whatever phrase you might use at that point. I think I made a mistake, and be kind of like, oh well, I have to start again. Here, it says open object. Small difference, but hugely important, because now what happens is it opens in Photoshop, not as a standard Photoshop background layer, but a smart object, a Camera Raw smart object, which means no matter what, I can do things in Photoshop like I normally would. I can do, Photoshop type things, and then go, that wasn't a very good adjustment. I think I overdid it. All I have to do is double click right here on this thumbnail, and it jumps right back to Camera Raw and lets me edit it, click OK, and it updates. So that in itself is a huge difference. And this is, by the way, this is quite a while. This is not the Camera Raw filter. This is Camera Raw itself. So if you have Photoshop CS6, you can do this. Where it gets more interesting, as you'll see in a second, is this Camera Raw filter. But what this allows me to do is to take advantage, much like I do with an adjustment layer, where I deliberately over-adjust something to help me do something and then put it back. So for example, if I was trying to mask the sky, I might deliberately overdo, like make it really horribly purple so I can see where I'm painting, and then once I finish, pull the adjustment back. You can do the same thing here. If I was trying to see better this part of the image, I would double click Camera Raw and make some over adjustment, and then once I'm finished, put it back again. Okay? So starting with a raw file, you can do this. Okay? Where it gets more interesting is the Camera Raw filter is now under the filter menu. So now you don't have to start with a Camera Raw file or a JPEG or a TIFF. You could literally be in the middle of a layered document and suddenly go, you know what? I need to do something like white balance or clarity. There's a good example. Clarity is a wonderful option that pulls out more detail in the midtones. There is no easy way in Photoshop today to, well, I shouldn't say that. Up until the Camera Raw filter, there was no easy way in Photoshop to increase the clarity. That was a Lightroom or Camera Raw function. There's no clarity slider anywhere in Photoshop. Well, again, now there is. But there didn't used to be. So what I would do, though, is I want to still give myself that opportunity to change my mind. So I'm going to take this background layer and convert it to a smart object. What this means is now any filter I apply will also be smart, i.e. editable. So kind of the equivalent of that going back and forth between Camera Raw and Photoshop. So now when I go Camera Raw filter, it looks like I'm in Camera Raw, because I kind of am, but there's a couple of important differences. One of them, there's no more information at the bottom because you can't affect that. Now it's like, I am this large, what would you like to do to adjust it? So for example, I could make some exposure and do some clarity or whatever, click OK, it'll adjust it. Now you'll see it says Camera Raw filter. Now, with the part of the interesting aspect of this, I'll just something really quickly to give you an idea, is I could take this area right here, and I'm just going to do it really quickly just to make a point. If I really wanted to step it up a notch, maybe, and I'm not suggesting I would do it this way, I just want to show you how this Camera Raw filter works. If I put that on a layer by itself, previously, once you had information like this on a layer by itself, even if it was a layer mask, the only option available would be levels or curves, or other adjustment layers. But now I could take even this one layer and choose Convert to Smart Object and do Camera Raw filter. So now I'm applying the Camera Raw filter just to that area. The first time I opened this and saw transparency in Camera Raw, I was like, that is cool. Because I was, because I'm like, now I can get down to a detail level that before was so difficult. Because as much as we'd all like to say that all my photos only need global editing, like overall, reality says to me, but I'd really like to go into those mountains and make them just a little more, and now it's easier to do that because I can go into just these mountains. This is going to look bad, by the way, because I didn't do a very good selection, but just to give you an idea. Push the clarity way up to just pull out some detail there. And now I'm starting to get something that's starting to look a little more interesting because I'm being a little more selective about it. Now, you could do the same equivalent with 5 adjustment layers, each with a mask. That certainly is an option. But the fact that things like, again, the recurring theme for me is clarity. Because clarity is a function that can do really nice things. Now, by the way, it can also be really bad if you go too far. But for things like detail stuff like mountains and rocks and things where you just need a bit more of that texture, there's nothing else like clarity, because everything else is kind of looks good, but the clarity can just suddenly go, wow, look, that's so much better. And before, you had to really plan ahead and say, okay, I'm going to do this in Camera Raw. And now you can be partway through. In fact, you could even, as I did in this case, start with one Camera Raw filter and then take a second area and say do a different Camera Raw filter for that. So in theory, you could have as many as you wanted. And I could also do the same thing by just duplicating the whole layer. Actually, that wasn't a good choice, sorry. Scratch that. So when you duplicate a smart object, it makes an exact clone. So if I adjust the Camera Raw filter on one, it will do it the same. So what I need to do instead is new smart object via copy, and that's a command that lets me edit the Camera Raw filter independent of each layer. So I can now go to this one, because now I'm going to look at just the sky. I'm not looking at anything else. I want to make the sky look better. So I'm pushing the exposure down and pushing the vibrance and saturation. I don't care what's doing the rest of the photograph, because in a moment I'm going to come in here and take my selection tool. Let's do it really quickly for the purpose of argument. Inverse a selection, and on the mask, fill it with black. So I basically said on this layer, let me hide the other one for a second. So what I'm saying is on this layer, apply the Camera Raw filter to the whole photograph, but only display this much by masking the filter. So masking plays an important role in everything we do with either adjustment layers or Camera Raw type work, because we can make a global change that we then make more specific. So I get just to this area right here. Okay? So that's the Camera Raw filter. I'm going to show you some other examples as we go, but this is kind of the approach that I take when I'm looking at something and say, okay, so was a challenging photograph to take, because the day that I was driving along and saw this, the sky was very bright. So trying to expose for the boat in the foreground and the sky at the same time was very difficult. And some people would say, well, put your camera on a tripod and take umpteen shots and do HDR. Okay, I'll just tell you right front, I'm not a big fan of HDR, because I feel like it started out really good, and then people discovered a couple of stars like, ooh, look at that, Harry Potter sky, yay! And it just became like totally artificial and weird, and to me, HDR was a way to deal with a photographic challenge like this. So what I tend to do, especially in this case, I didn't have a tripod, so I took one photograph, and I figured as long as there's a little bit of detail in the sky, I can live with that. So the approach that I take with this is I look at it thinking right from the get-go, I'm going to do 2 different exposures in Camera Raw. One for the boat and one for the sky. And that's a very common way to approach it. And you could even take it another one, say, and one for the grass. But in this case, we're going to do 2 exposures. So what you have to do is just kind of train your eyeballs to ignore the fact that you're like completely ruining either the sky or the boat partway along. It's going to look bad until we're finished. So right now, I'm looking at the boat. I'm not looking at the sky. So don't look here. Look here. Not here. Here. Don't look there. Stop looking there. Because I know someone's going to look there. Ooh, look at the sky. Don't look at the sky. Okay, so I do whatever adjustment I want to make the boat look the way that I want. We'll just go with something like that, and I hit Open Object. Because this is still set to that Camera Raw Smart Object now, I still can go back at any time and go, now that I've done that, it's a little too much. My strategy here actually was to deliberately go a little higher, a little further, because I wanted the sky to really be pure white, because that'll help me in a moment. Now, I kind of said this really fast before, so I want to make sure I clarify this because it's very important. When you have a Camera Raw Smart Object, I want to make a second one that I can edit independently of the first one. So if I just did the good old Command or Control J duplicate layer, it wouldn't work because it's a clone. In other words, if I adjust this camera raw setting, this one would change too. And I need them to be independent. And love it or leave it, this is the name of it. It's called New Smart Object via Copy. So the wording means make a new smart object, an independent smart object, by copying this one. It's not a clone or a duplicate, it's a copy that's separate. And that's where you just have to use that command. Because now what that let me do is on one of these layers I can go back and adjust for the sky, and the other one I can adjust for the boat, and I'll combine them together.
And where did you get that from?
I just right-clicked right on it, or
Control-click
Control-click and choose New Smart Object via Copy. And if you don't do that, so this is really important, if you just said, because your habit is Command or Control J, you will have two layers that look exactly like each other. So if you go back and adjust the camera raw, the other one will go, okay, I'll adjust too, because it is a clone. So this is the one part that catches people, because like, I thought I was doing this right, I've got two copies. Well, not exactly. You've got a duplicate, and we don't want a duplicate, okay? So now I have two versions of this. The top one, I'm gonna say, is the one I'm gonna use for the boat. So let's go and click, I'm gonna hide that, click on the bottom one, and double click. And now I'm changing my entire thought process. Now I'm saying, don't look at the boat, look at the sky. Because that's the adjustment I wanna make, because I wanna look at it and say, all right, let's try and get some detail back out of that sky. And I have to push it pretty far because of the type of day, but look at all that information that was there that I can suddenly see that I couldn't a moment ago, okay? And I tend to do this in a step where I deliberately overdo it a bit because it'll be easier to see what I'm doing in the next step, and because these are both camera raw smart objects, I can pull it back if I need to. So click OK. So now I have two versions of the same photograph. The top one has the boat looking the way I want with the sky completely blown out. The bottom one has the sky looking the way I want. Now I have to combine them. And there's various ways of doing it. And with today's technology, the place I always start is with a tool like the Quick Selection tool and see if I can't get decent results. Now in this case, I think I went a little bit overboard with the sky because it's almost so white that it's blending into the boat a little bit, but I can see if we're getting closer there. And it's also important, one of the things some of you heard me say yesterday was I always have this thought in my head that I want to end up with the look that I want. So I'm not at all in any way convinced it's going to look perfect right from the get-go, but it's going to get fairly close. So what I want to do is I want to say, hide the sky on this layer. Well, the way that I do that is I need to add a layer mask. Right now, if I added a layer mask, it would be the wrong way around because I have the sky selected. So if I click on the Add Layer Mask button, now I just have a really bad photograph because it took the worst of both layers. So my mask is the wrong way around. So the simplest solution is to press Command or Control I to invert the mask. And now you can see it's getting closer, other than the fact that apparently he painted his windows white because you can't see through them at all. So there's always a little giveaway like that. But that, frankly, is part of the reason that I deliberately overdo it, because you'll see things like that and go, oop, I missed that. Now I'll go back and tweak that. So for example, here, I could still use the Quick Selection tool and just try and get these little windows in here, and on my layer mask, fill with black. Now that I've got to this point, I'm looking, okay, the sky is way too much and the boat is probably a little too blown out, but that's okay because now I have both of these that I can work on. If I double click on this one to go back to camera raw and say, let's lower the exposure a little bit and the contrast, and because I think I went a little bit much, and see what that looks like. And then do the same thing on this one. I went a little bit overboard, so let's pull it back a little bit. And part of the reason for doing that is because any edges between the two and the mask that would look too obvious, now we're making it less of a jolting kind of a contrast between the two of them. Okay. Wow, it looks so different up there. Okay, everyone come up here and look at my lap. No, that's a little too much. Okay. But this is the point. This is exactly what I would do, is go back and forth and say, oh, now that I've changed that, how does that look? Okay. Usually what happens, frankly, especially when you use a tool like the Quick Selection tool, is there's some little edge giveaway thing happening. Like the little grass here just has a little funkiness to it that you're like, yeah, it doesn't look quite right there. So one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit as we go here is that when you add an adjustment layer, it automatically has a layer mask attached to it. In this case, for it to work, I had to add a layer mask. Well, if I look at the layer mask for a second, we do that by Option or Alt-clicking on it. You can see there are some problems with it. For example, when I made my selection, so I need to fix that. But I can also see, does this grass really look like grass, or is just kind of a wavy line that doesn't look as good anymore? So with that in mind, when you're making a selection, there's a wonderful command called refine edge that lets you make a better edge. When you already have a mask, there's an equally good command called refine mask that can actually usually tweak the mask, have you go, oh, okay. And the way you get to it, very simply, double click right on the mask, and there's the button that says mask edge. If you've used refine edge, this will look familiar to you because it's exactly the same, except it's not for a selection, it's for a mask. So just to take a step back for a moment, my typical workflow when I'm doing anything of this nature is I make my selection, I use refine edge to try and make it look pretty good, and then click make layer mask. Then, once I've done a bit of tweaking with my two camera raw layers, I'll go back and choose refine mask to give myself almost a second run at it, to say the first one worked pretty well, but I need to get a little bit closer. So I might come into this area and say, these are the areas that I need you to focus on. And you just paint through with this tool. It's already selected, the edge detection tool, and very often just doing that is enough to make it look better. One of the things that I usually do in here is change the view to black and white, because that will show me the equivalent of mask. See how much better that looks now? It looks like actual grass. It still might not be perfect, but it's much closer than it was a moment ago. I still have a bit of work to do, but at this point you can get the idea that now I have these two independent layers that are both tied to camera raw, so I can adjust them independently of each other. Now, just to clarify, could I have done all of this with levels or curves? Yeah, just not with quite the same control because of that one missing piece of clarity. But if it's just, I want to adjust the sky and the boat separately, you can do that with two curves or levels adjustment layers with masks. It would be the same kind of thing as I showed briefly before. So that opportunity always exists. I just personally like camera raw because I feel like it gives me more choices. Levels and curves are both really good. Curves just takes it up a little notch more because it also throws in the mix white balance and clarity and sharpening and things that levels and curves alone don't.
So we had a question come in. Do you have to be using a smart filter or using a smart object to use this camera raw filter? Is that the only way to get that in there, or is that just the way you recommend?
The reason is just to get the editable nature of it. So this method, I start in camera raw. These have to be camera raw smart objects. But in that other scenario where I took one layer and said, let me apply the camera raw filter, I just prefer to make it smart so I can continue to edit it. These days, I can't think of many times I ever apply a filter without making it smart, just because I prefer to have that ability to go back and edit it.
Great. And then one more, and this was an interesting one that a couple different people want to know the answer to. As a raw smart object, is it possible to reopen a previously developed raw image in Lightroom or ACR, be able to access, review, modify, or delete either individual or multiple previous local adjustment edits? So if you've worked on something in Lightroom Camera Raw first, and then you bring it in as a smart object, can you access the stuff that you did previously?
Yes, and it's a little different in each case. So Camera Raw, it's just like we saw here. If it was already had adjustments, those would be brought over, and then I can go back and forth. If you start in Lightroom, there's a little bit of a kind of a weird twist to it, but it's once you do it once. Most people, I shouldn't say that. Many people, some people, occasionally, no, I don't know how to say it.
There are people.
In Lightroom, the most common thing I see is people use a command called Edit Photo in Photoshop. And that is a one-way street from Lightroom to Photoshop, much like we did initially with Camera Raw. If I was starting in Lightroom, I would like to be able to go back and forth. But it's a back and forth with a bit of a detour. So instead in Lightroom, there's a command that says open in Photoshop as Smart Object or something like that. It has the word Photoshop and Smart Object in it. It's a little further down in the list of options. That brings it in here to Photoshop. So I'm going to use, I always talk with my hands, but even more so now. So I start in Lightroom. I say open in Photoshop as a Smart Object. If I double click on it, it goes to Camera Raw. And then once I go back to Photoshop and save it, it goes back to Lightroom. So it's kind of this roundabout way of doing it, but what it does is it means in your Lightroom catalog, you would have a file called nameoffile-edit.psd that you know is a Photoshop document that contains all that information that you can edit. So if you're starting in Camera Raw, it's very back and forth. In Lightroom, it goes Lightroom, Photoshop, Camera Raw, Photoshop, Lightroom. Okay? But at least it gives you, and it will carry forward anything you've already done in either one of those programs.